You know that in the Catholic Church there are various groups. There are traditional groups who would look at you and they say, Mary McAleese is trying to set up her own religion and she's made herself Pope of that religion.
I've even had applications. Yep. No.
Are you trying to set up your own religion?
Absolutely. No. There are enough of them in this world. There are enough religions to go around in this world, and the last thing it needs, I think, is a new one. The one that I belong to, the Christian faith that I belong to, that's my first port of call. I see myself essentially as a Christian. I don't see my Christianity as necessarily cutting me off from Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or any other ism for which I would have huge respect, enormous respect. I'm very entranced by the monks, you know, the early medieval monks, people like Columbanus and Gaul, whose parents and grandparents came out of the pagan tradition. You know, were pagans, weren't Christians at all. And so they had to show respect to those traditions. I look at Patrick and how he absorbed pagan traditions, sort of Christianized them, but in doing that also showed respect to them. So, you know, I don't see my religion, my faith in Christ, as a vehicle that cuts me off from people, because if it was to do that, I think that would be to slap Christ in the face. It would be to crucify him all over again. And I think what attracts me to the story of Christ is the way in which it opens us up to each other with love. And that's the test for me. So layering on top of my Christian faith, then I'm born into the Catholic denomination.
Mary, could I just ask you, I'm aware that...
Or baptised into it, not born into it, I should say.
I'm aware that around Dublin, around Ireland, that a number of groups who are of committed Catholics who are deeply frustrated with the hierarchical church, that they are now organising their own Eucharistic meetings without a priest in their own homes. What do you make of that practice?
We'll soon all be doing that anyway, the way things are going, if they're relying on the number of priests coming through to deliver the sacramental experience that we were so lucky to have. I mean, we had such a rich sacramental experience growing up. And that's what I'm very fearful about, that we're probably going to lose that, precisely because our masters in the Curia, you know, have not done any future planning. And
but what do you make of that practice? Do you?
Well, I'm not part of it, but I think, you know, look, if people get from that the comfort that helps them in their lives, the grace that helps them in their lives, that I have absolutely no problem with it in the wide world. The only thing that I would say is this, that for me, people say, well, why don't you leave the church? I probably hear that at least 6 times a week. And so I go back to the fact, 1.2 billion people worldwide, a history, you know, of centuries of investment in the world, a lot of it awful, and a lot of it good. And I think of the wonderful people who introduced me, like Father Justin Coyne, to the idea of this magnanimous, magnificent, loving God, who gave us the tools to take out of our world the misery that is caused by human beings. I mean, God knows there's enough misery in the world without the misery we cause. There's enough misery, you know, through illness, death, global warming we're also partly at least responsible for, if not wholly. And so here we are in a world where most of the most devastating things in our lives, leaving aside death and illness, but the hurts and the woundedness, particularly the wars and the conflicts and the wars that go on in households, the wars that go on in workplaces, are caused by people who are in some way out of control, who are not bringing a loving sense of the respect for the dignity of others into their lives. I think that if we could get 1.2 billion people as members of a church that really, really lived that really believed that, and that studied itself, that turned its spotlight inwardly, which we're very bad at doing. The Curia is not good at taking the spotlight and turning it back on itself. and self-critiquing. But once it gets that facility, but we, at the end of the day, we are the spotlight now. We, the people, we keep insisting, turn the spotlight back on our church.
Are you going to keep speaking out?
Yes, I think so. For as long as, there's breath in my body, I think that I believe that it is the right thing to do. I'd like to see my church flourish. I'd like to see it not hurt the way that it does. I'd like to see it stop hurting LGBTI people. I'd like to see it stop hurting women. I'd like to see it become a champion of complete diversity and inclusion. I'd like to see the Curia stop writing those dreadful documents. Just stop writing. Really, take a year off writing and just listen. Because there's way, way, way too many words. This avalanche of words, written words, that they seem to think solves every problem. When what we really need, and Ireland is a good example of it. I think Ireland's got a lot to teach the church these days about listening, about intergenerational debate, about respectful debate, about letting people have their say, tell their story, and not hit them over the head immediately with a principle or a rule before they've even got the first sentence finished, but to listen respectfully. I have to say, for me, I've been in, I love the church. I love its liturgy. I love the Eucharist. I love the idea of grace. But I'll tell you the truth: the most grace-filled day in my experience, the day I just felt the euphoria that grace, I think, should bring into your life. The most euphoric day was the day after the same-sex marriage referendum. I just felt the country flooded with love. Yeah. Flooded with love. Yeah. People kept coming up to us in odd places like petrol stations and throwing their arms around us and hugging us and not able to speak. And I think this is what grace does, that if you can't articulate it, at least you can feel the love, Mm-hmm. And I think our country helped flood love through that, through listening to each other and responding, I could say with deep humanity, but also with a humanity driven by the divine. Driven by the divine. Because I think if that's not the world that Christ wants, then who is he? Who is this Christ? If that's not the world he wants, does he want this miserable bunch of people sitting, in Vatican City State, a tiny little empire the size of a golf course, churning out interminable documents? And we're about to get two documents that are going to depress me, I know, before they've even been written, on gender ideology, because of course one wouldn't be enough. They'd have to send out two. One is coming from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the Inquisition that used to be, and still largely is. And the other one is coming from the Congregation for Catholic Education. They have warned us in advance that these documents are coming. And so I'm grateful that at least, I'm steeled now to expect them. But honestly, they'd be better off not written, because I'm telling them now, a day is coming very soon when they're going to have to eat those words.
Mary, we're almost out of time. Finally, what's your take on Pope Francis?
Interesting. Martin and I were in the square the night we were in St. Peter's Square the night that he was elected. So it was wonderful to be there. We were jumping up and down with everybody else. Well, at least I think I was jumping up and down, shouting Vive il Papa. And we were there when, he came out. He looked kind of grumpy at first, and I thought, oh, Lord. And then suddenly he broke. Do you remember? He actually, maybe he was just plain shocked, but he came out and he looked like he might be grumpy. And then suddenly he broke into this remarkable smile, and then we had that wonderful the Buonasera, which opened up everybody's heart immediately to him. And I have to say that knowing that that one of the greatest acts of charity ever performed by any pope was Benedict's resignation, and it was wonderful. And I thought that here is the man now who takes that gift to the church and will use it well. And in some respects he has, and in some respects he hasn't. In probably the best respect, he has opened up debate. And that's been a really good thing. That's been a healthy thing. And the church now is a very boisterous place. I mean, it's a place where people are arguing the toss in a way that we really had stopped doing under John Paul and Benedict. The Catholic Academy in particular completely silenced. The theologians really silenced, marginalized those who were not just utterly orthodox by both John Paul and Benedict. So I think that's a good thing, And I was really very happy that within a few days, that he had referenced Cardinal Casper and Casper's book on mercy. I thought, we are on a journey here. This is going to be really exciting. But on the other hand, he's a human being. He's not a divinity. So the worst thing of all is to project onto him all the expectations we have and all the desires and wants we have for change, because we're not going to get those. He's made that obvious. From day one, he's not going to change doctrine. But what he's probably going to do is stir up pots. And in stirring that up, maybe in the future, maybe out of that comes the kind of listening church that will become confident enough to change the doctrines that require to be changed. That's my hope. Has he, on women, really, he's as tedious as the rest of them. Honestly, when I saw him describe female theologians as the strawberries on the cake, I just thought, yep, that's another one. That's another one that goes into my computer under dopey things popes have said about women. And the list is very long. And that's another one. And he said quite a few of them. And this week, he didn't. This week, he was interesting because he referenced Christ. I have to say, in the Voices of Faith, the speech that I made in Rome, that was where I pleaded with the Curial Church and actually I pleaded with, not them, leave them out of it. They're just overrated courtiers. But the Pope, I pleaded with the Pope to listen to the voice of Christ. Why? Because he was the person who did offer equal dignity to women. And that's what he said this week. Now, the problem with that is we can quote that, and I think he expects us to quote that, because sometimes he throws those things out, hoping they'll be quoted back, the Pope said. But what he doesn't do, and what perplexes me, is he doesn't take them and say, now let's look at how we can take these words and examine our own consciences as church. He doesn't bring them home. He doesn't turn the spotlight back on the church itself. And the Curia are not trained, as I said, to turn the spotlight on themselves or on the internal church. You see, the church is so used to speaking out to the world as the pulpit of the world, speaking out with moral authority. And its own ideation of itself is of an institution that is, yes, divinely instituted, and therefore almost exempt from external criticism. And there are very few vehicles, very few places where it is subjected internally to criticism. There is no vehicle, for example, for holding the Pope accountable. Mm-hmm. And since the Curia serves the Pope, then they also become unaccountable. So the Pope, and we know that he has attempted to reform the Curia, but I find the vehicle used for attempting that reform is a poor vehicle. You get 9 cardinals and you ask them to reform the Curia. Right. I honestly, if he was serious about reforming the Curia, I'd say let Mick O'Leary loose on them for a week. And boy, would they be reformed. And they'd be making money as well. And they'd be great. And so, what you really need are people with organized, people who know how to manage significant organizational change. And John Paul talked about reforming the Curia. Paul VI talked about it. Poor John the 23rd talked about it. You remember he was asked how many people in the Curia, many people worked in the Curia, and he said about half. And so, it's always been problematic for popes, this Curia. And some people, John Paul thought, oh, there's just too many Italians in there, so, let's bring in a few fellas from Ireland and a few fellas from other places and throw them all in there, and so that'll change things. And it probably just made it linguistically more difficult. Then somebody said, oh, I know, we need a few women. So they tapped a few women and they throw them in, the hand-picked women who's, and they then tell us that, oh gosh, we've got women in the Curia. Well, fine, but do they have any voice in there? Or are you just marginally increasing the visibility of women, but also ensuring that insofar as they have a voice, it is their master's voice? So they just become part of the echo chamber. They challenge nothing. So, so we had that reform. We had the reform, those kind of fustery little reforms. The problem is the Curia is a medieval body designed for a medieval court and a medieval empire that no longer exists. It needs root and branch. We just need a simple administration. With people who are good at administrative duties. And that might be someone, and we need the jobs to be advertised, the best people to apply, and we need the best people appointed. We need them to be properly paid, because I do think that also creates problems within the Curia. The fact that they're not, even though I don't think that their work rate is phenomenal apart from the documents they churn out. But I do think that there are issues to do with, the whole structure. Managerially, it's a mess. It's a mess. I mean, you and I would remember, we were both at the Voices of Faith conference, and we know that a journalist who worked for Vatican Radio and who attended the conference got a phone call from Cardinal Farrell telling her that she must not, under any circumstances, mention Voices of Faith in the conference. I mean, really. And as she said, but he's not my boss. And that's what you get there. A blurring of lines.
Of the Curia.
A blurring of lines. Because, these people feel that they have really almost quite monstrous powers.
It's unchecked power. Mary, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
What a pity.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We Are Church.
My pleasure.
It's been a total pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.